why I wear it.
Safe and you're somehow getting used to fight this long battle. So I welcome you all for this panel discussion for today with some amazing experts. And today we are discussing the power of podcast and its capabilities as a robust marketing tool. Today's event is brought to you by Designhill, world's leading creative marketplace that caters to creative needs of businesses and individuals alike, who can source high quality designs from professional designers and buy unique products created by independent artists across the world. Currently, we are serving in more than 180 countries, and we are having a pool of talent of creative artists of more than 160K people who come from various backgrounds and various creative experiences. Today, we have with us Dave Rohrer. He is an in house and agency digital leader for more than 20 years. Dave has solved problems and increased revenue for companies both large and small. And we'll be very much interested to know how and help you guys with Dave's experience. Dave is also the co host of the Business of Digital podcast and runs Chicago based digital agency called Northside Metrics. Dave is also an internationally recognized speaker and can be found sharing his digital marketing wisdom at conferences like Popcorn Pro and Midwest Digital Marketing Conference and the Craft Brewers Conference. Also with us is Tim Crawford. So before we take on to Tim Crawford, I'll ask Dave to say hello to the audience.
Hello, all. Thank you for joining today.
So we have with us Tim Crawford also. Tim is ranked as one of the top most influential CIOs. He is a transformational CIO with broad experience that takes a provocative but pragmatic approach to the intersection of businesses and technology. He has served as CIO and other senior IT leadership roles with global organizations such as Konica, all covered Stanford University, Knight Rider, Philip Electronics, National Semiconductor. Tim is also host of CIO in the Known and CXO in the Know broadcast. Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Also with us is Greg Shepard. So I'll have to ask Greg before we start this podcast that how he's looking so fit and energetic today than the maybe the previous time we interviewed her. But I'll ask him right when we start this podcast. So Greg is a founder partner of Boss Capital Partners, a global investment syndicate that focuses on series seed technology businesses that prefer operational expertise and guidance to achieve capital efficient and rewarding outcomes. Greg has built and sold 12 businesses in biotech, transit tech, ad tech, and martech platforms. He's also a Forbes author and contributor and has featured in publications like Fortune, Entrepreneur, The New York Observer, The Deal, and Thrive Global. Greg, please go ahead.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And also with us is Joe Pardaville. Joe Pardaville is broadcaster, actor, writer, director, producer. Born and bred in New York City, Joe was a radio personality who was heard on legendary New York City radio station 95.5 PLJ, where he was part of their successful morning show for over 15 years that had over a million listeners daily in the metropolitan area. While at PLJ, he interviewed everyone from musical artists like Ed Sheeran, Coldplay, Chris Martin, John Mayer, Lady Gaga, Justin Bieber, the Jonas Brothers, more, and like everybody who's a big name in New York City. And he has also spoken with entertainers and newsmakers that include Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, Mike Tyson, and Kim Kardashian. Joe, can I get to meet all these guys while I come down to NY City?
My mic's off. Hey, how you doing? I really love this function where you control when everyone can speak or not. It's sort of like it's I guess it's like every kind of radio guy's dream that they could shut everyone's mic on and off whenever they feel like it. But thank you very much. So I'll be standing by and I'll wait till you put my little microphone icon on. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay. So also with us is Kenneth Kinney, and he's nicknamed as Shock, and he's a keynote speaker, accomplished marketeer, lead generator driver. I'm sure, Kenneth, people are going to listen to you a lot because lead generation is something that every small businesses would love to know more about. And businesses growth consultant. He's led national campaigns working with brands including Axiom, Citi, Chase, Target, GM, American Express, FedEx, Honda, Toyota. God, these are like everybody. Kenneth, how is this possible?
No.
Microphone again. There you go.
Perfect reason for a hot mic. So I worked with a lot of large clients running, especially TV, and I worked in a TV and radio background for years. But first of all, before I just want to say hello to everybody. I'm working on my own speaker demo reel right now. You guys set the bar pretty high. I need to get you guys services because that intro video was the best of any virtual webinar or seminar I've seen this year. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much, guys. You just have to give a really hands up to our creative director at Designhill. He works really amazing. I mean, we have got a lot of people speaking about our videos and our ads and all the fillers that we play during our conferences. So thank you so much for your testimonial again. So Kenneth, he's the VP of Marketing and Digital Strategy at AI Media Group currently, and as well as the host of a Shark Perspective podcast. So welcome everybody on the show. I'm sure we're going to have an amazing session today. And guys who are watching us today live and people who are going to watch this on YouTube, it's really great that our team has put up such efforts to bring these people on board and together, and so that they can help you guys with all the stuff that's going around in your business and help you set up podcast and benefit from it in terms of really deriving the marketing benefits. So before we start this session, I'll give a quick 3 minutes time for Designhill to talk about our services.
Looking to get your boss to remember your name? Head to the world's #1 creative marketplace.
Head to the world's #1
My
creative
company promoted me to
marketplace.
head up our latest real estate
My company
development
promoted me to head
project.
up our
I was
latest
excited.
real estate
Then
development
anxious,
project. I
then
was excited.
petrified. How was I going to hire the team,
then petrified.
get the
How was
designs
I going to
completed,
hire
and
the
design
team,
beautiful
get the
presentation
designs
materials
completed,
on our
and design
lean
beautiful
budget while impressing my
presentation
bosses,
materials on our lean-
some of whom are still learning my name?
Good job, Mitch.
My name's Lawrence. That's why I went to Designhill and got the design help I needed that fit within my company's brand guidelines. The process was simple. Designhill's design contest ensured I'd get a ton of results I'd love. Start by picking a number of designs that inspire you. This one's good, and that one. This one speaks to me. Then share some information about the project. Lastly, pick a package that fits your budget. Do you just want a logo, or do you want it all? Then, boom. I got more than 60 custom design options to choose from, as well as all the other graphic design assets I wanted. And it's all backed by Designhill's 100% money-back guarantee. If I don't find a design I like, I get my money back. You can't lose. Now I have what I need to make a splash at my meetings, with everything from business cards, pamphlets, posters, and more. It's real.
Let the world know it's real and build your brand with Designhill.
Ready to start up with our questions right away and the topics that we have agreed to discuss upon today based on the suggestions that a lot of people who are watching this live today have given us on mails and while onboarding and registering for this webinar. So let me start right away with Joe. Joe, the basic question first, why podcast at all?
Well, podcasting right now is obviously taking off. I don't need to expound all the stats about all the people listening to podcasts these days, but it's just a great way to connect with people in sort of the old school radio way, which I came up with, which radio has always been sort of the most intimate medium that's ever existed. It's people usually listen to it while they're sitting home alone or in their car. So it's a great way to connect using your personality directly with an audience member. And one of the things I've always loved about radio and sort of translated into podcasting is this connection that you can't create in any other medium. All of the mediums, can kind of like dull the senses with sounds and videos and overwhelm you. But the idea of podcasting is just that connection that you get that you can't get in any other medium.
Great. So Kenneth, would you believe that podcast is only for people, who have established and, got out of every medium its benefits, or it's just for everybody who's also starting out, maybe a small business? Because usually, what businesses do is that once they've explored all the other mediums, then they switch to podcast, that, okay, let's explore this medium as well. But should a small business owner also start podcast channel right away without it being the last resort?
No, not necessarily as a last resort, but marketers have a tendency to destroy anything they touch with, especially with too much content, too much advertising, and things like that. So you really got to start thinking about your strategy and what the story is. I mean, you're trying to grab people's attention, and what Joe just talked about. I mean, I want people to, whether they're commuting to work or sitting at home relaxing, closing their eyes, being able to have that sort of intimate, if you will, and thoughtful conversation with people. But just the idea that you have to go out there is not anything that people need to really think about just running and jumping into without thinking about the strategy beforehand. I think people also have to think about the kind of content you have, even if you're at a small business, can be really powerful. I mean, some of the most powerful stories can be small businesses, but you're still competing for people's ear time, if you will. Just like we're not all competing. If you had a pizza business, you're not competing against every other local pizza shop. You're also competing against people like Joe Rogan. So you got to think about having thoughtful content and conversation that can help people learn and be infotained, if you will.
Yeah, and also, don't do a podcast just because everyone's doing a podcast. The old joke has become, the podcast is the lower back tattoo of the 90s. Just because everyone else is getting them doesn't mean you should do it. And first and foremost, you have to love the medium. If you don't love radio / podcasting, don't do it. Because we've seen, any old radio person has seen television people try to make the jump to radio, and it never works. It just never happens because you just don't have the skill set created. So not that you have to be a master communicator, but if you don't love doing it, it's not going to work.
Okay. So Tim, let me ask this question to you. Specifically small business owners, they face this challenge of, presenting themselves on podcast or advertising on the podcast without having, tested the medium itself. And they would pretty much, rely more on Facebook or let's say Instagram and all these sort of social media channels. So what would you have to say to such people to explore this medium and really benefit out of it and take the first movers advantage within their localities or communities or their business and industry?
Well, I think there are a couple things to consider, and Joe and Kenneth kind of touched on them. One is just podcasting as a medium. Different people learn and listen and view things in different ways. And so podcasting becomes another medium that you potentially need to tap into. But first and foremost, even before you go there, you need to think about who the audience is that you're trying to reach out to and how they're going to consume it and what they're going to consume. So think about the medium, think about your content. What is the message you're trying to get across? Is it just being used as a sales medium? It's probably not going to be too effective. It's probably better to start with some sort of education or entertainment angle first, and then layer upon that the appropriate ads or appropriate support as needed. Now, keep in mind that not all podcasts have ads that support them, and that's okay. Case in point, my two podcasts, neither of them have advertisements behind them because they're actually used as an educational vehicle that then supports other parts of our business. And so you have to think about all of these components coming together. Don't just look at it as, okay, I need to start a podcast, I need to have a regular cadence to it, and I need to put ads behind it. I mean, it's much more involved than that. And kind of to Joe's point, you really have to love it, and you have to know that your audience is going to love it before you even start down this path. Because doing a podcast kind of halfway isn't good. You have to have good audio quality or good video quality if you're going to produce something that's really interesting, that's going to keep the audience engaged. And so there are a number of factors which I think we'll get into in this conversation to consider.
Okay. So, Dave, let me ask this question to you. I mean, what should be the starting point, to start a podcast for a small business owner? Can you suggest some tools or some marketplaces or, agencies who help you set it up and, do a hand holding initially, and then you can just take it on?
So I prefer to talk over write. If you can read the T-shirt, I just wrote an article for a rather large place. Just like you guys post blog posts all the time, the amount of time it took me to create that one post, my co-host and I can usually do 4 podcasts, and I can edit them, and then I can have them transcribed. So now I have 4 pieces of content to produce. And so back to the question that a couple of people were asking is, also is why should you do it, or how to get started, or when? If you are a person that struggles to write content, but you also don't want to do video, so a webinar or Facebook Live or Instagram is not the solution, then I would start there. You can just use an Anchor, it's free. You can just use a recorder on your phone and just start there. You don't need to have, like, we all have Yeti mics, we all have, various degrees of cameras and all sorts of gear. You honestly can just use your Android or Apple phone and just record into that and start there and see what stories you come up with, see what kind of content you can create just by talking into that by yourself.
Okay. So, Kenneth, would you believe that, because some businesses I have interacted with, they say that, we have to have a huge library of content initially so that we can support the series of podcasts, or can it be just spontaneous and then people can produce a podcast, let's say, once in a week? Do we need to have a library first, or can we just do it spontaneously once in a week?
No, I think you can do it once a week. I will say before you start anything, though, to kind of coincide with that, is you got to make a commitment. Really, that's one of the things that I preach the most. And if you've got an audience that you're going to talk to, or one that's following you now, if you're going to start a podcast, you've got to have a real commitment to sustain whatever schedule you want to do. I know a lot of top podcasts that do bi-weekly. There's plenty that do monthly. There's plenty that do daily. I do multi-times a week myself. But you've got to, my audience knows that I'm going to keep coming back with content. That to me is the bigger point that I always love to convey with people that consult with me on this, is to make certain that they know that that audience is depending on me for content. It may be a small commitment, but it's still a commitment that you're making that's ongoing with your customer base, the listeners that are your fans.
Great. So, Greg, let me just know it from you that, how did podcast happen in your journey? Because we have talked in the past about your, entrepreneurial journey and all that. I mean, you have had a vast experience in touching different aspects of, entrepreneurship. So how did podcast happen to you, and how has it benefited you in your business?
So I got to tell you, I was given the podcast because of the Forbes book deal, and I got Joe, and Joe is incredible. You can't. So I think I agree and disagree with some of the people that have spoken. So I think what I would do is I would say, start out with, why should you have a podcast? Well, everybody does demand generation, right? You have to do DG. And so when you look at demand generation, there are 3 pieces. There's watch, listen, and read, period. And so listen is podcasts, watch is YouTube, and read is blogs, articles, things like that. So I've been producing content for about 25 years, since the 90s. And I've seen these things change. And honestly, when Forbes said, hey, you're going to get a podcast, I didn't really take it that seriously at first. I was kind of like, well, all right, fine, another form of content. I have found that I have gotten more. So I do it for deal generation, right? So I'm looking for investment deals. So I have gotten more deal generation through the podcast than I have through watch and read first. And so that would be why, right? Second, I would say is, who. So, I disagree with the concept of doing it over an iPhone or that sort of thing. I think that you have to have, the voice has to be clear. I think the message has to be clear. I think the narrative has to be clear. I think you need to plan the end in mind. Like, what is this thing about? The overall narrative of the podcast. I think that editing is critical. And if you don't know how to do that, you got to learn how to do that. There's a lot of stuff to learn. With Joe, I mean, there's questions, right? Like you have prepared questions, right? So the questions need to be engaging for the audience. So there are these elements in terms of the how, the what and why I sort of gave you, but the how that I think are fundamental, right? And what Joe does in terms of obviously this is Forbes, right? So this isn't cheap, but you're talking about a guy who's got, one of the best producers of this, you can find, who does the questions and it finds the right guest. And I got to tell you, I'm guilty. I will go find a guest and put it on. Joe's smiling. I'll go find a guest and put him on the podcast. And the guy's got a great brand and everything, but just sucks on a podcast, right? So it has to do with what questions are you going to ask? How entertaining is the guest? Preparation for the podcast in terms of having good sound and in terms of having, clarity on the internet and stuff. And then editing, I think, is critical. So that would be the how. And then let's talk about the outcome. So you have to realize what the outcome is. And once you understand what the outcome is, then you can design your audience. So just like you would design an ideal customer profile, you design the audience that you're after. So I'm looking for a startup entrepreneur Series C in the tech sector. So my guests, the conversation, and the people I'm in front of are people that would find interest in that from different levels. I had a professional basketball coach who brought leadership different, right? And then I've had financial people that focus only on financial, but these are all arms or modules, if you will, in a hub and spoke system when you start up. And that gives you the element of understanding who you're focusing on and how you get in front of them and why you should do a podcast in the first place. I also learned the hard way. I tried to do a couple of podcasts, even from a studio. And I learned that this is a subject matter expertise. I believe that you don't just go out and try to bust out a podcast. I think that you need to learn how this works, and to prevent yourself from making mistakes early on, you need to start with somebody that knows. And that's because if somebody goes to a website and you can't get them to convert right away, you'll lose them. Same thing with podcasts. Somebody's going to listen to an episode, they'll skip a couple, listen to another one. If they get the feeling for it, just like you test out a new TV show, you lose them. So I think it's fundamental to go with somebody that understands this and has the experience. And Joe is, I hate to just preach about, but the guy has fundamentally changed the way I see podcasts, because I thought it was like bullshit initially. And now I'm like, oh my God, podcasts are the deal. So.
Sure.
Also, I think it's important on Greg's point about the, everything sounding good. If you're a small business, you're a high leverage individual, you're not just anybody doing a podcast, because it has to meet your brand standards. So if you're the best plumber on the planet, you got to have a really good podcast. You can't be a kid in your parents' basement doing TikTok videos thinking I could be a podcast star, because it just doesn't work. Going back to a point earlier about doing a podcast on your iPhone or Android phone. Yeah, that's fine for just about anybody. But if you're a high leverage individual, if you're a Greg Shepard who's dealing in multi-million, multi-billion-dollar deals, he doesn't want to record a podcast on his phone. He wants to have a great, high quality, almost professional sounding podcast as possible, even though he's a novice in the field. But having someone like myself, or having one of the other members of the panel here giving you advice and coaching you along the way, that's what matches your brand.
So, Joe, what is the checklist that we are looking at?
Sorry, one more thing I want to make sure. I think this is really important for your listeners, and I'm doing this for your listeners. So, I think that this is really important, is that you get a lot of guests that will monologue like I'm doing right now, and they'll go on and on. And what Joe will do is he'll break up that in the editing, and then we come back in and ask questions in the middle. So instead of just listening to somebody, he edits it so that I can plant voice in between. And I think that's really important too, because it can't just be a one-sided. It needs to be like a conversation.
Sure. So Joe, what I was asking you is, what is the kind of checklist that needs to be there before starting a podcast? Because I'm sure Greg touched upon a lot of things that need to be there, and since you're the pro, then you can enlighten our audience here. So what is the checklist that people should look at before starting the podcast?
First and foremost is, again, I'm going to reiterate a couple of points here, but who's your audience? But not only that, is what is your audience going to be? If you expect to come out and have 100 million downloads as a Joe Rogan podcast would, you are going to be greatly disappointed. So that's why I go back to my original point of loving what you do, because if you love what you do, people will love what you are doing. So if your main lead, your main inspiration to doing a podcast is, I want to be the next podcast star, you will fail miserably. If you want lead generation like a Greg Shepard, you can't just expect leads to come out of a podcast. You've got to work that content to produce those leads. You know, Greg Shepard has like an amazing reach on LinkedIn. He always likes to tell me how many LinkedIn followers he has. I forget how many it is. It's a lot. But anyway, he built that before he started the podcast. And now all those people in his LinkedIn network get this content that sounds really good and matches his brand of success. So those are super important. Know what you want, but also temper your expectations. You cannot come in and expect to be the next great podcasting star. It happens over time. One of the big misnomers and one of the things that I think is lost from the translation of radio and podcasting, and I'm sure the gentleman will agree on this, most people who got into radio either started in a smaller market and worked their way up into the larger markets and succeeded. In podcasting, you don't have that playing field. Basically, everyone starts at zero and then goes from 0 to 60 or 0 to 1,000, depending on their quality. So that incremental growth of a career that you would see in any kind of other medium, whether it's TV, video, whether it's coming from print, you're starting in smaller markets and working your way up. So in podcasting, you've got to look at it as your lifeline as a podcaster has to grow. Just like any other broadcaster's career would grow, you just have to expect that slow incremental climb to success. And if you do it and you're passionate about it, it could pay off.
Okay, that's great. So Tim, why should a business advertise on podcast? What are the incentives out there in comparison to the other mediums?
You know, I'm probably not the best person, candidly, to ask about advertising a podcast, just because we don't do that. We don't take advertising in our podcast. We look at it beyond that. It's not just about the podcast as its own kind of discrete vehicle and everything is contained within it, but rather it becomes the vehicle that then carries us to support other activities that we do. But, you know, I want to touch on something that Joe and Greg mentioned too, which is always be learning. You know, always be thinking, always be learning. You know, we've got a pretty esteemed set of individuals here that have a lot of experience with podcasts. I've got a Post-it pad here that I'm already starting to take notes on, just learning from these other folks. And so my point is, even those of us that have experience with this, we're still looking for ways to improve. We're still looking for ways to perfect our craft. And so it's not just a slam dunk that, you know, you set up a podcast and you're good to go. And kind of to Joe's point, you know, you go from 0 to 60 or 0 to 100 or 0 to 10,000. It doesn't work that way. It takes time. And the same thing goes with advertising. I mean, I've had people approach me about sponsoring and advertising both podcasts. I had folks coming to me and wanting to sponsor my podcast before the first episode went live. And that's how much demand there was at the beginning. But the reality is, for my audience, I don't think advertising is helpful. And so that's something you should be thinking about, is that advertising is not always the right solution for the given problem.
I agree with you. I think the podcast is advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Like putting advertising on top of advertising just pisses people off. You know, like YouTube, right? It's like, you're like, what the hell? You know? So
also, I wouldn't think about advertising if you're starting out a podcast, because no ad agency is going to even sniff at you until you have 100,000 downloads. So so that's why I say it's an innocent climb. You will not get any advertising dollars whatsoever, unless, I will say, you can side hustle it. Like if you are in a business where you have a lot of connections and you know someone personally, say, hey, listen, I'm starting out this podcast. If you give me 10K, I'm going to put you as a sponsor. I'll put you as a mid-roll, a pre-roll, a post-roll. That's great. But no ad agency, and this is where the big Boku bucks come in, are coming from these major ad agencies that advertise the same as on television and on radio, that will come in advertising. But again, they will not even look at you until you're in that 100K space, and that does not happen overnight.
And it's also vertical appropriate, right? Like if you're like for my podcast, I'm doing a Forbes podcast on Boss, and you know, business people that are trying to learn about that, that's an inappropriate place for advertising. But I've seen advertising on more entertainment type podcasts. That may be a little bit different. Those people are purely entertainment. They're not there to learn. They want to burn up some time, versus you got somebody in business who's like, I got just enough time to watch to listen to a podcast, and then 3 minutes of it is an ad and you already lost them. You know, so the tolerance of somebody to even have an ad is also vertical specific. I think Joe would know better than me, but
yeah. And one of the adages growing up, as you know, as a kid, I've always wanted to be in show business. You've got to go in knowing you are not going to get rich off of this. So it's same when it comes to podcasts. Do not go into podcasting expecting to become a wealthy person, because the odds of that are very low. It's like being a professional athlete. There are some professional athletes like a Patrick Mahomes who signs a $500 million contract, but then there is a professional athlete who makes $50,000 a week on the practice squad of an NFL team. So it just goes to show you that if you want to make a lot of money, podcasting is not the way to do it. If you want to help, you know, lead generation, you want to help build your brand, yes, do a podcast. But if you're looking to get wealthy, podcasting is not the venue for you.
it's an advertising venue. It's going to cost you money.
Great.
Yeah.
So Kenneth, let me ask you this question. You know, how should a business owner test the podcast waters? I mean, should he start with advertising on, business podcasts where he gets, he gets known and gets lead generation, or should he pitch himself as a guest on all these podcasts to see how people are, receiving him and his business ideas? Or should he start his own podcast right away based on the, small snowballed audience that he already has on some platform? Or maybe, Joe mentioned that Greg already has some sort of audience on LinkedIn, which he leveraged for his podcast, and it kickstarted. So what should be a business owner's incentive to test podcast waters?
Well, I would say, at least for this example, I would use the latter two. If you're a small business, you're generally not going to get a lot of people. It just depends on what kind of business it is. Running into, as Joe said, want to give you money to sponsor for your small business. Plus, nobody wants to listen to another direct response channel all day long. It gets very annoying, and it makes people tune out. But there's a big benefit to doing the two. First one is take advantage of being on other people's podcasts. If anything, just from an SEO perspective, for somebody that lives on website value alone, it's worth a lot of traffic. Two, if you're going to build your own, make certain that you have the commitment to your audience, because if you have built that following, if what everybody's saying is true, and I agree with it, focus on building your audience first, or at least making them fans of what your brand is, whatever that is, whether it's you or it's some basket weaving set, whatever the hell it is. Make certain that there's a reason that they're coming to you, not just that you're going to start a podcast or a TikTok channel or anything else and then think everybody's going to come running to you because they haven't heard of your product before and you're going to grab them with a podcast. It just doesn't happen. Joe Rogan didn't happen without Fear Factor, the UFC, and a show on Radio Days on NBC. There's a lot of things that go into making that for most people. He's an exception. So at least make sure that you spend some time building your brand, unless you have a lot of money already behind you to help elevate that podcast.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no better way to build an audience than stealing someone else's audience.
Yeah.
I always tell anyone I'm producing a show for, look at how many Twitter followers there are, how many people they have on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Use that, because that is the best way. The term is called cross-platforming. So if you can steal anyone else's audience by either you appearing on theirs or they're appearing on yours, that's the best way for organic growth. Because the only way to grow a podcast, and I get this question every day from anyone who signs up with one of our packages, how do I grow an audience? What's the magic bullet? And I say, there is none. But the most organic, and I say in terms of ease, it's the easiest way to do it, because all you're doing is presenting yourself and presenting the other person involved. So stealing an audience is the only way to go about doing that.
Yeah.
So Dave, would you like to give a technical? Greg, please go ahead.
I just want to say, I wanted to make a big point, because you asked a question that I don't think was answered, which I think is relevant for the people listening. And that is that, should you be a guest or a host? And I think that you have to do both, but you have to have a brand to start out with. Like if you want to be a guest on somebody's show and it's a worthwhile show to be on, you have to have, I do about 2 or 3 a day right now. So those guests, I post and I promote those podcasts with my audience. And in return, they post it to me. And then I get audience that I use to draft into my podcast. So I think that, it gives you, food for content. And it also allows you to do, so I would advise that people do both so long as you have to have some value to add, right? If you can get into a podcast and you don't have value to add, then it says something about the podcast.
Okay. So Dave, would you like to give a technical head start to people who wish to start their own podcast, since you're too, involved in your podcast in terms of editing and the stuff that's going around your podcast? So what all people need to have in terms of the technicalities, and what should they look ahead in terms of, the scalability and the resources that they would be needing to continue it? Because the frequency and the recency is paramount for having a good podcast.
That is actually another good reason to start being a guest first is, if you have something to sell or if you have a lead gen, you can promote it, but you also then get to watch and see what other people do. So like my podcast, my co-host and I, 99% of the time, it's just us. So we don't use Zoom. We don't use certain things. We also don't have a studio because we're distant and a little bit of cheap. But we have, over time, implemented better solutions. Technically, we've upgraded our mics, we've upgraded certain things, but we did start small. Because we were also, like Joe talked about earlier, we wanted to do it. We've both been speakers at conferences, but we didn't know if we were going to love podcasting. So we invested some, we got started, and then we started looking at, okay, what third-party services? We looked at Zencastr, we looked at Zoom, we looked at Skype. Skype's horrible, drops calls. With Zoom, you can download the files individually. The quality is not the best, but every service you look at, if it's an in-person or if you're distant, each service has pros and cons. And it really depends on your budget, what you're trying to do. If you're just starting, if you're going big, if you're a big company like Microsoft or, Twitch or anyone, the bigger the company, the bigger you have to start, because everyone's going to assume that you're going to be out of the box, super production, super great. If you're a small business, and I know a couple of people here, Joe and stuff, don't like it, but if you don't know what you want to do, don't invest money, use your phone. But don't publish it either.
Yeah,
practice editing it. What's that?
I said, there you go. I agree with that. Yeah.
Well, no, don't publish it. I have a small client who is trying to produce content. I'm like, you know what? Get your stories out, record them, see what the quality sounds like, see what you like doing. How long is it? Because that's the other problem is how long is it? You're editing. I admit I edit my own stuff. We're very simple because we just do it. We do one take usually. Most of the time I just have to edit out sound. I suck as an editor. I'm getting better, but I honestly suck. But I watch lots of videos. I keep improving. Just last week, I was looking at 3 different tools that might help me. We've been podcasting for 3 years. I'm still looking at things to make me more efficient, better, quicker, and sound better. And so it's just a constant learning, constant new technology, constant, investment in being better.
Okay. So Tim, what are the advices or tips or some hacks you would like to share with people, to start that first episode of podcast? How do they get people hooked with first episode of their podcast?
Well, just kind of bridging off what Dave was saying, the first thing is you need to make sure that your first episode is something that's really catchy, something that's really going to draw the audience into, because that becomes your beachhead. And so you have to think about the content. You have to think about the guest if you are in a guest type of podcast. One of the things I did when I launched my first podcast, CIO in the Know, is I went big. I looked for a large CIO that was really well known, that could pull in a really good audience. And it happened to really kind of create a great beachhead for the podcast. The other thing that you also start to think about with that first episode is, what is it that you're going to do and what is it that you're not going to do? Kind of to Dave's point about editing and whatnot. One of the things I learned was, I started with, like Yeti mic and whatnot. And you see in the background behind me, I've got a Shure SM7B mic that I typically use.
Fancy.
But well, we just moved into a new house, so nothing is set up yet. Hence the AirPods that are my current mic. But my point is, you have to think about how to kind of get off the ground in a way that is comfortable and in a way that can at least get you started, but that you know what you're good at and what you're not good at. One of the things I learned right out of the gate was I was starting to do the editing myself using GarageBand, and I'm like, this editing aspect, and I'm an audiophile, this editing aspect is not for me. It's a waste of my time. And so I did a lot of research and I found a company that actually is a group of audio engineers and they edit podcasts. And so I send the 6 elements being podcast intro, episode intro, guest recording, host recording, outro, jingle, all 6 elements I send to this company for each episode. They do the mix down, they do the leveling, they do the editing for me. Because that's just not something that is a good use of my time. And so I think it's important to think about what is a good use of your time. And I think the content absolutely needs to be a good use of your time. You need to focus on content. It needs to be relevant for your audience. Start there, figure out how to do the other pieces, think about the technology. It doesn't cost a lot to get started. As Dave said, you could use your phone, but quite frankly, you can get some pretty good audio quality mics for very inexpensive. The Yeti Pro that I see Joe is using today, that's a pretty darn good mic to use, as a starting point. There you go. So we've got another one in the house. I've got one in the closet. I think we've all started there. But think about where you start, what you're good at, focus on the content first and foremost, and then branch out from there. As you go through each episode, you will start to understand what you need to edit or change or tweak up. So for example, right now, my kind of workflow that I use is I do guest interviews across Zoom. And so it's usually the format for my podcast is either in person where I'm doing an interview, or it's across Zoom remotely. And I have the guests come remotely, but I don't record in Zoom. I actually feed that audio into an external digital recorder. And then I have my local recording of that separately using the big podcast mic. And so you think about your workflow, you think about the different components, you think about your timing, your cadence, whether it's monthly, weekly, and then you have to start thinking about who your guests are and get them lined up. You can't easily, in my case with my workflow, I can't record today and publish tomorrow. There's a certain lag time that has to come into play because of the production requirements. And so what that means is you need to have a queue of guests lined up. And so case in point with CIO in the Know, when I launched it, my objective was to have 6 or 7 episodes in the can, or for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, pre-recorded and ready to go, ready to publish before I actually launched the first episode publicly. And we had probably 4 or 5 right out of the gate, and they were just coming fast and furious. And so that's a good indication that you're getting good traction from the guests, but you won't know what success you're going to have until you start doing those first couple of episodes, and you'll start to get a feel for it once you get through the first couple of episodes as to, what people are attracted to or not. You'll also start to understand how you can coach your guests. If you have guests, how you can coach them from an audio perspective, making sure they have good audio, that they're not just on speakerphone or in a noisy environment, or as I am today in a very echoey environment. So think about all of these components for your first, but focus on content first and foremost.
Great.
I will say on that though, just a quick thing about the first podcast. It's not that important in terms of the quality of it, because this is not a TV pilot where you have to sell to a network. Your first podcast and your 10th podcast will sound vastly different. On Greg Shepard's part, He is 10 times a better broadcaster than he was in episode 1. But episode 1 lives there because it's a good quality podcast, but there's improvement there. As long as you're proud of that first piece of work you put out there and not embarrassed by it, it's okay that your first podcast isn't that great. Most people do not consume podcasts linearly. It's just not the way people do it. The other day I was on a road trip and I was listening to Crime Junkie podcast from 2019. It's just people, it's an on-demand medium. So people listen whenever they want, wherever they want. So don't worry that your first episode may not be as good as your 10th, because more than likely, most people won't even hear that first podcast. They'll find out about you in the 8th or 9th, and then they'll be like, let me go listen to some of his older podcasts. And then they'll probably be like, that sounds good. Or some people will be like, well, this guy's gotten really good. So don't put so much pressure on that first one out of the box, because most of us don't start really good. I don't have any air checks of myself in my early 20s because I know I sounded terrible. So
mine was
really
a dumpster fire.
Yeah, so I'd rather, so don't worry so much about your early podcast, because there's going to be a progression. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it.
Okay, that sounds great. So Kenneth, let me ask you this question: that, apart from the first audience, how does the persona, if we can put it, or stereotype the audience of people who listen to podcasts, how does it look like, and how to get them hooked beyond first episode?
Sorry, repeat that question one more time, please.
What I want to ask is, how does the audience who listen to podcasts look like? If you have to categorize them or broadly describe their characteristics. I mean, like Instagram has a certain audience that subscribe to it. Facebook has certain audience. LinkedIn has certain audience. I mean, if you have to put it in layman's means or terms or language, what would you describe the persona of an audience who listens to podcast?
Somebody that prefers to listen to audio to learn. That's such a broad topic, because there's plenty of podcasts about Instagram, for example. There's plenty of podcasts about LinkedIn. There's plenty of, Joe Rogan's got a podcast talking about God knows what at any one time, smoking something with Elon Musk. I mean, the topics are so broad. It's really it's not necessarily a one size fits all. Maybe like a LinkedIn is focused on business, or Instagram, cute girls in bikinis. I mean, it's, I don't know that I could necessarily put it in that sort of realm, but I do know that at least that a lot of people consume podcasts for what we, primarily do it for, is to help people learn, help them fix a problem. So but it's just the same. Joe mentioned true crime dramas. I mean, a lot of those, or I think you did, true crime, those kind of dramas is a totally different audience than what's going to typically listen to most of our other podcasts. It just depends on, probably overarching, is people that like to consume media through an earpiece.
And I will say, though, that they have data on this, and they say that podcast listeners are loyal, affluent, and educated. I think there's something like your audience is 45% more likely to be a college graduate to listen to podcasts.
One of the stats I used all the time was, I forget what it was. It was something like 75% of the people were making over $75,000, which, again, a little more upscale of an audience, but again, that's such a diverse background on top of that.
Yeah, but if you're a small business, you want to reach these people with the bucks. It's whether you're in radio, television, advertising. Right. It's that adult 25-54 demographic that everybody wants, is the sweet spot for everybody, and those are the people that make the money and spend the money.
Let me put it this way: then, if you're a business, you start a podcast, it is typically the kind of audience you want who's going to buy your product or service.
That's great.
Right. And I was just going to add to that, Kenneth.
Please go ahead.
You have to think about your audience, and you have to think about the persona within your audience. So are you talking, so in my case, I'm actually targeting an executive audience. I'm not targeting someone within the IT organization, further into the IT organization, that might be an administrator, database administrator, or developer, or operations person. I'm specifically working at an executive level. And so the reason why that's important is that will start to drive your decisions around who your guests are and who your guests will attract. It'll start to drive questions, what questions you're asking, the content that you're starting to develop. It'll also start to drive decisions you make in terms of where you go with your podcast. And so it's important to think about not just the persona of people that generally might listen to podcasts, but more specifically, what is the persona of the person that you're trying to target for your podcast? And get at least in my case, I wanted to get very specific with that. I know in other cases, podcasts are meant to be really general, kind of general purpose podcasts. But think about whether yours is going to be more general or there's certain personas you're trying to target.
That's great. So, guys, I'm sure you're loving this session, and we have touched upon different topics as of now. So, let me take a small break of 3 minutes, and once we are back, we'll take the questions that audience has asked in the question section.
Clarematics is a full-service video agency based around video production. We created a brand that fit our identity at the time, but as we've evolved as a company, we found that that original brand didn't quite fit our aspirations anymore. Finding a partner to rebrand your entire company takes a lot of time and effort. Finding Designhill was an incredible lifeline. Designhill offers a money-back guarantee. If we don't like any of the designs, we get all of our money back. The stuff that we ended up with were well beyond what we had been seeing on other creative services platforms. After creating a simple design brief by answering some questions created by Designhill, we posted, and within a few days, we had over 250 entries. Designhill's platform made it easy to communicate with all of the potential designers. Eventually, we picked a winner. In addition to a logo, our designer also created a letterhead, business cards, and banners for all of our social media platforms. With Designhill's help, we now have a brand that meets our aspirations. We're ready for the future and everything that it's here to bring.
All right, guys, we are back with our panelists. So let us take questions here from the audience, and first one will go to Dave. Dave, how does SEO in the podcast world work? I mean, Suzette is asking here that how can they increase the searchability of their podcast, since there are a lot of podcast producers out there producing huge amount of content every day. So how does it work?
Well, one, host it on your own site or a domain or website that you control. Don't just use it on Libsyn or just have an iTunes if you care about SEO. If you don't, then, host it wherever you want with whatever service. But if you want to care about lead generation, if you want to care about SEO, and you want to care about controlling the brand and maybe you do want to do ads or something like that, you need to have a web page. I write up 200 to 400, maybe a little bit longer summary, and I bullet out different things that we talk about in each of our episodes. And then I also do a transcription service and drop in the transcription on the site for each episode. And you can also upload that into YouTube. You can upload that into other places to include it along with it if you do that. But that's what we do. That's the main thing, is just to keep all of the content. And then we take that video, that podcast, and basically create an article out of it.
Okay, that sounds great. So, Kenneth, Mitzi is asking that many business owners are using podcasts as their marketing strategy and, to enhance customer experience. How can businesses differentiate their content and make their content stand out, for the searchability in terms of their competition and really getting people hooked to their episodes over episodes?
One would be not to sound like everybody else. I mean, there's so many podcasts that are pretty vanilla, and it's frustrating. You've got to really identify what your unique voice is. If people are going to take the time to tune into you, make it worth it. And so, with a lot of folks that I work with, I often give them advice on making certain that they have a voice that sounds different than other people. For me, for example, mine's called The Shark's Perspective. That's because I've been swimming with sharks literally since I was a kid. That's a nickname I've had since I was a kid. It's literally and figuratively my hook, if you will. So people know that as much as I'm going to talk about Seth Godin and Guy Kawasaki, I'm going to talk about stupid stuff like hammerheads and bull sharks. So if you like that mix, and those are the people that often follow me, is for that sort of fun and silliness on top of some advice for business. That's the unique story that I bring. So I know that, and that's what I focus on trying to deliver to anybody.
Okay, that sounds great. Joe, let me take this question to you. That people really believe that once they produce a long form content, then they can really break it down into small pieces of content which helps them bring the scalability into coming up with different episodes of a podcast and really doing it with less of a resources and less of a time investment on it. So do you really agree on this, and how can people do it?
Well, I think, one of the things with creating your own content, which is super important, is the fact that you own it and you can do whatever you want with it. So for one example, say you do a 1 hour podcast. You're like, okay, this podcast is out to the world. What can I do with it? First and foremost is you can create what's called audiograms. And they're basically short form videos that you overlay audio over like a JPEG, usually your logo or something like that. And it's usually, a minute to 2 minutes of like content, essentially a teaser to your podcast. And then you can use that as sort of extra content for your social media feed, your website, and you can be like, hey, did you miss this conversation I had with blankety blank? And then it's the 1 minute conversation, and then you attach the link to the actual podcast. So what that does is it creates additional content, but at the same time, it promotes your original base content of your podcast. So all forms of that. Those are called audiograms, but there's all different things. You can make little YouTube videos with it, but you can use that audio any which way you prefer, but always use it as sort of like I say, like your podcast is sort of your Sunday sermon. So make sure you're expounding what you want to say in that podcast, but then have these little other elements as sort of like your traveling preacher going from town to town and telling people what it is all about.
Great. So Greg, how do people go about promoting their podcast? I mean, in terms of the downloads and people listening to it, and how can people explore different mediums to promote their podcast?
I mean, I promote it through the email, the website, all the different social media channels. And then, Joe produces little pieces of content and links and stuff that I can plug in. And that's what I do, so I promote it everywhere all the time. So I'll do it. I'll do one that says, new podcast covering da-da-da-da-da coming up, next week or something. And then I'll say, okay, it released, here's the podcast. And then a week later, I'll be like, don't forget to catch the podcast that we did last week. And that's how I do it. So, I mean, mine has grown pretty fast because I already had an audience, but it's I can tell the growth is not just from the audience, because even before I post stuff, I tested it in the beginning to do an A/B test, and I noticed that it was just growing organically. So some of that just has to do with, Apple and Spotify and that sort of thing. And then some of that has to do with the fact that I'm in Forbes website. So, I mean, kind of, I guess I'm cheating a little, but.
Can I add to that real quick? One of the
Yeah,
things
please go ahead.
that I talk about with people all the time, and I noticed this, somebody else had done this with me on occasion. A couple of you have done this. You want to enable whoever your guests are, for example, to help cross promote it as well. I know we talked about that a lot, but one of the SEO, tricks I think that will help provide a little bit of lift as well is blog about when you've been on somebody else's site. It's, we know all the time that we're supposed to blog about our own podcast, but when you're on somebody else's audience, another way to help continue to grow that audience of your own is to blog about being on any of these guys' great shows. So it's a little thing that I've seen some really smart SEO folks do, and they have big reaches of their own, and they're not, some of it's self-serving and some of it's just great content for their audience. And it's not like they're going to lose their audience you're not going to lose a listener because they decided to go look at somebody else's blog or something like that.
Kenneth, that is such a great point. I pumped the hell out of the ones I guessed on.
Yeah. I've
yeah.
done with SAP, for example. I've got a good friend that works there, and she blogged about it on her own in their own big, massive, huge employee base. And I love the fact that she did that. Lee Oden did it when he was on. He's one of the most well-known marketers on the planet. He did it with Top Rank when he was on my show. He posted it on their own social channels, which you hope to do. But also they wrote a blog about it, and it's great content for them. So I think so often we think about the content just for ourselves, and sometimes there's ways to help enable a furtherance of that audience just by doing something simple about blogging on somebody else's show.
And also on top of that too is don't be afraid to write your guests' social media posts. That's what I do for every podcast I'm on. I will literally write the post, so then all they have to do is copy and paste, because a lot of people are not as savvy or social media experts out there, so they're lazy. They could, if you tell them, hey, do me a favor, keep post that you were on the show, they'll be like, I was on the show, check out the link. No, you write it for them and you say, hey, I appeared on Greg Shepard's podcast. We talked about entrepreneurship and the ways we can help fix the failure rate. Bam, with the link to the podcast. Don't be afraid to do that for your guests. I've never had a guest come back to me and say, like, you didn't have to do that. 9 out of 10 times they'll be like, oh my God, thank you so much for writing that, because I don't ever know what to write. And a lot of times, I'm doing a climate change podcast and I wrote for this and the scientist appeared on it. He's not on social media. So I literally wrote it for him and he copied and pasted verbatim exactly what I want him to say with the proper tags on it. So he doesn't have to search on, oh, what is this person's Twitter handle? What is the link I'm supposed to use here? Do it all for them. And you do that all as sort of your post thank you email to the person once they've appeared. You say, hey, thanks very much for appearing on this podcast. And then you don't even say, please go ahead and promote. Usually what I'll just say is suggested tweet and just leave it there with the link. And then what they do with it is up to them. But at the same time, you're winning that battle because your podcast is going to look good on their feed because you've written it for them.
Yeah.
We're what we do.
Good at being self-promoters. Most people are not.
They're not.
Yeah.
A little bit of a, just this much, a smidge of being able to go do that on their own. That's perfect. I mean, give them a suggested tweet. That's fantastic.
Well,
so Dave, would you like to add to that? Please go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick. Well, when we've had guests say, hey, I was just on the Business of Digital podcast, it'll be coming out soon. We'll save it and then go back in a week or 2 or 3, whenever it goes live. And everyone that liked it and commented said, oh, that's great or awesome. And what'd you talk about? We drop in the link to it. So, hey, here, it's live now. Go check it out. So we've already created some awareness 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, a week ago. And anytime we've discussed it or posted about it, we go back and we drop in the link so that everyone gets a notice that, 2 weeks ago was like, oh, they don't remember. No one remembers what the heck they saw on Twitter 10 minutes ago. So now it pops back up and it's now live. And it's like, oh, yeah, I was really interested in that. And then they follow.
Yeah.
Great. Tim, please add to that.
Well, I was just going to add that don't forget that, kind of to Dave's point, that people don't remember what they saw on Twitter 10 minutes ago. They may not have been on it 15 minutes ago when you tweeted it and may not see it. Don't be afraid to retweet or repost links to the different podcasts. That will just grow your audience even further. And frankly, it's renewable content. It's content that might have gotten to the audience you had a year ago when you first went public with that particular podcast, but now you have a larger audience that you're reaching out to. And so you want to make sure that they're aware of that as well. And kind of to Joe's point earlier, I mean, take some of those snippets and use it as an additional asset that you can then build upon. So there might have been certain nuggets that have come out of a podcast episode that are food or fodder to be able to build either a blog post or maybe even another episode. Maybe you have a follow-up episode with that particular guest to go deeper into a particular subject. Or if you're just doing a monologue, as Greg was saying earlier, that might be a specific podcast on that specific topic. And so there are a lot of different directions you can go with the content. But then also don't be afraid to promote it yourself and get it out there on the different channels multiple times so people get to see it.
Okay. I'm actively changing my website right now. So look at it in about a week when it's done. But one of the things I was thinking about again that I'm going back and I've revisited some posts is that as you build up a library of whatever your current podcast is, I'm getting close to 250 episodes on this one. I'm starting to look at some of the pieces again that I've already grouped that were specific to a vertical in marketing or advertising or business. And now I'm taking those and positioning those as an additional group. Maybe they didn't want to hear, X, the person on this one particular call. Maybe it didn't on that podcast. Maybe it didn't drive enough traffic, and Y did a little bit more. But maybe they were all talking about, I'm going to give you an example, content marketing or graphic design or whatever a subject is. You can start positioning those subject groups, and that gives more reason for people to go listen to the collective group you have rather than just one podcast that you did 3 months ago.
Great. So I think that pretty much sums it up.
And Kenneth, well, I just want to add
Yeah,
something
please go ahead, Tim.
on what Ken was saying. And so something I've seen with other podcasts that I think is really important is you need to be clear on what your podcast stands for too. What is the message of your podcast? What is the content about? I think, to Kenneth's point earlier, where he might talk about sharks as well as other technologies, that's one thing. But I've seen some podcasts that they travel the countryside on topics. And so it's really hard to understand, do I go to this podcast or listen or subscribe to this podcast because I'm interested in X or Y? And so I think it's important, and others may disagree with me on this, but I think it's important to be clear on what is it that your podcast stands for. So for example, CIO in the Know is the intersection of business and technology, but we take a provocative but pragmatic look at it. And so that we're talking about that intersection of business and technology. We're not going to be talking about home building. We're not going to be talking about other topics that are far afield. And so I think it's important to think about that again. So you tie that into your persona, you tie it into your content, your questions, and the rest.
And also
So
be yourself.
That is pretty
That's
much
super important. You got to be yourself when you're doing this. When I'm coaching any talent, I say, be yourself at 11. Whereas, be sort of be a semblance of who you are. Like even the greats, like Howard Stern, is not like he is on the radio as he is off the air, but that's him. That's a version of him cranked up to 11. So first and foremost, when you're doing podcasts, and I know we've sort of hem and hawed over all these issues about making a podcast, it's got to be you. So if it doesn't capture your spirit of who you are, it's not going to work. People can see through that. Don't be a phony. Joe Rogan succeeds because he is Joe Rogan. He's got these crazy political views. He's not worried about upsetting people. If you're a small business owner, you have to be afraid of upsetting people because it's going to cost you money. So make sure that you are yourself.
That's wonderful. So guys, this brings up to the end of this wonderful discussion today with Dave, Greg, Joe, and Kenneth. I'm sure you guys have taken away a lot of stuff about how to start and how to develop it and how to get people hooked to it and really, benefit out of in terms of advertisement and, really pitching yourself as the guest with other co-hosts and bringing them on your show and really growing your podcast and promoting it across different channels. So thank you so much, guys, for being here today. Thank you so much, Dave, Greg, Joe, and Kenneth. Thank you for being with us and sharing your insights on different topics that we have touched upon today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
So guys, this is not where it ends. So we have got multiple panel discussions coming up. We have got boost your PPC performance, best practices, tips, strategies, and trends, which is coming up real soon. I'm dropping the link to register for that panel discussion in the chat section here, and to stay updated with events like these and to suggest us more events and speakers whom you want to listen to on Designhill official YouTube channel. Please give us suggestions on our official LinkedIn channel, which I'm dropping the link of in chat section. And to watch this session, you can go to our YouTube channel and you can watch it end to end if you missed some part of it, and if you want to re-listen to some part of it, to take notes or to take that and use that to build your podcast channel. So for all the business owners who are listening to this and wish to source high quality graphic designers through a marketplace, I'm dropping the link of Designhill in the chat section. You can visit Designhill and source high quality designs and build your brand right away. So so thank you so much again for being here with us today. On that note, I would like to end this today's discussion, and thank you guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.